Now, let me ask you, can Mr. A, who lodges a criminal complaint against Mr. B, and based on that criminal complaint, the police force or the security agency where that criminal complaint was lodged, based on that complaint, invited Mr. B, after the invitation, interrogated Mr. B, after the interrogation, decides to prosecute by charging Mr. B to court. After the prosecution, can Mr. B come forward to say that he had been maliciously prosecuted? Whether or not Mr. B can do that will depend on certain factors, and that is what we want to examine today in this video. Well, first and foremost, we must understand what malicious prosecution is before we can determine whether Mr. B can bring or file a complaint or file a claim of malicious prosecution. So what is malicious prosecution? Malicious prosecution has been determined and defined by a retinue of cases by the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, and in fact, a lot of textbooks have written about what malicious prosecution is. Now, it simply means the institution of criminal or civil litigation against an individual without reasonable, unjustifiable, without a reasonable or probable cause. Now, what are the ingredients that a person who claims that he or she had been maliciously prosecuted, what are the ingredients that he or she must prove? There are about 4 ingredients or 4 grounds that a person claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted must show the court. Now let's look at these 4 grounds. But before we look at these 4 grounds, it's important, I need remind you and appeal to you, subscribe to this channel. And when you subscribe to this channel, please click on the notification button so that you can continue to enjoy more legal premium content that drops on this channel. Now let's look at what are the 4 grounds required given by the Supreme Court in determining or showing that a person has been maliciously prosecuted. First, the person claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted must show the court that he or she was arrested, detained, and imprisoned. That's a very critical thing. It's a given right. Secondly, the person claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted must show the court that the arrest, detention, or imprisonment was illegal or unlawful. The third ingredient required for a person claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted is that the person must show the court that the defendant in this case, now this current case where he or she is claiming that he or she had been maliciously prosecuted, the defendant was instrumental in setting the law in motion towards his or her malicious prosecution. So let's break it down. In this case, Mr. A must show the court, or Mr. B rather now, must show the court that Mr. A was instrumental in setting the law in motion, in, putting fire to the law in motion. That's like what setting the law in motion means, so that he can be prosecuted. And the fourth one, which is very important as well, Mr. B must show the court that the prosecution was without reasonable, without probable, without a justifiable cause. Now let's look at another important aspect of malicious prosecution. For a person claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted, the person must show that the decision of the prosecuting agency was not made independently. So in a situation where the prosecuting agency took the decision to prosecute the person who is claiming to have been maliciously prosecuted, if that decision was independent of the person who lodged the complaint, then how would you show that the person who lodged the complaint was instrumental in setting the law in motion for the prosecution of the complainant in this case? So Mr. B now must show that the decision of the police or the decision of the prosecuting agency in prosecuting him was based solely on the allegation, which were not true, which were unjustifiable, which were unreasonable, on the allegation of Mr. A. So if the decision by the prosecution agency was made independent of Mr. A's allegations, then a ground for malicious prosecution against Mr. A, might be difficult for Mr. B to do. Finally, it's also important that if Mr. B can show the court that during the course of the prosecution and after the prosecution, the judgment of the court was in my favor, that is a very good ground for proving malicious prosecution, because after all, the judgment of the court in this prosecution that you initiated against me, I won. It was in my favor. Therefore, the prosecution was malicious. Whether or not Mr. B is going to win in court is another kettle of fish entirely. But these are ingredients that the Supreme Court, in a retinue of cases, has decided that the person complaining to have been maliciously prosecuted must prove